It was a warm evening in downtown Arlington, and the busy streets buzzed with life. People darted in and out of shops and cafes, engaging in their conversations. Elijah Grant, a decorated Navy SEAL on leave, casually walked down the sidewalk, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, well-fitted jeans, and sneakers. A leather messenger bag hung over his shoulder. He was heading to a local bookstore to pick up a novel he'd been meaning to read for months. His mind felt relaxed. Just as Elijah crossed an intersection, the unmistakable sound of a police car pulling up broke his focus. Tires screeched faintly as the car came to a halt, and a white police officer, Officer Cardon, stepped out with deliberate slowness. His sharp blue eyes scanned Elijah, sizing him up like a hawk eyeing its prey. "Hey you," Cardon barked, his voice cutting through the noise of the street. Elijah paused mid-step, turning to meet the officer's gaze. "In a bit of a hurry, aren't you?" Cardon continued, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Elijah remained calm. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing tension, while others seemed unbothered and continued walking. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Just heading to the bookstore," he replied evenly. Cardon folded his arms, a smirk curling on his lips. "Bookstore, huh? What's in that bag of yours?" he asked, eyeing the leather messenger bag. "Carrying anything I should know about?" The implication was clear. Elijah could feel the weight of the stares around him, already sensing the prejudice behind the officer's words. But rather than reacting with anger or frustration, something else flickered in Elijah's eyes. Quiet confidence. "You want to check?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, almost challenging. Cardon straightened, clearly not expecting that response. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped. A beat of silence passed as the officer's hand hovered near his utility belt. The crowd subtly thickened, more people stopping to watch, phones discreetly emerging from pockets. Elijah shifted his weight slightly, still relaxed, but something about his presence made Cardon hesitate. "All right, officer," Elijah spoke again, his tone as calm as ever. "Let's do this the right way." The growing crowd murmured, their curiosity piqued by the crackling tension in the air. Elijah's calm composure seemed to unnerve Cardon. The officer squared his shoulders and took a step closer, his boots clinking faintly against the pavement. "Drop the bag," Cardon demanded, his voice harsher now, as if raising his voice might mask his uncertainty. Elijah remained still, his expression unreadable. "Sure," Elijah said after a moment, carefully removing the bag from his shoulder and holding it out. His calmness wasn't submission, it was strategy. As Cardon snatched the bag, Elijah's gaze remained locked on him. There was no fear in those dark eyes, only a quiet power that seemed to unsettle the officer even more. "Hands behind your back," Cardon barked, reaching for the cuffs on his belt. At this, Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice steady and unyielding. "You're being detained," Cardon shot back, avoiding the direct question. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like a bad joke. A few people in the crowd exchanged incredulous looks, and a woman muttered, "Here we go again." Elijah gave a slow nod, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "All right, Officer Cardon, let me help you out," he said, stepping closer but keeping his movements deliberate. Cardon stiffened, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Stay right there," Cardon ordered. Elijah stopped and raised his hand slightly. "Relax. I'm just giving you my ID." He slowly reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sleek card holder. He extracted his military ID and handed it over. Cardon hesitated, glancing at the card. His smirk faltered for the briefest moment as his eyes scanned the name, the rank, and the words United States Navy SEAL etched onto the ID. "You still think I fit the description?" Elijah asked, his voice calm as ever but now tinged with subtle amusement. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in closer. Phones were now openly recording, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Cardon, clearly flustered, clenched his jaw, and tossed the ID back to Elijah. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," he muttered. "Stay put while I check your bag." Elijah crossed his arms, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes said enough. "Go ahead and try to dig yourself out of this hole." As Cardon unzipped the bag and began rummaging through its contents, Elijah took a small step back. His calm demeanor was now laced with a quiet confidence that felt almost theatrical. "Make sure to show everyone what you find," Elijah said, gesturing toward the growing audience. The tension in the air was nearly tangible as Cardon crouched, pulling open the zipper of the bag. The crowd leaned in, phones aimed like paparazzi capturing a scandal. Inside, the contents of Elijah's bag were neatly arranged, as if placed with military precision. A neatly folded book, a stainless steel water bottle, and a sleek black laptop sat side by side. Cardon hesitated for a moment, his fingers grazing the book before pulling it out. "What's this?" Cardon demanded, holding up the book as if it were contraband. The title, Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence, was emblazoned across the front. The irony wasn't lost on the murmuring crowd, though Cardon didn't seem to realize it. "That's a book I wrote," Elijah said evenly, the faintest trace of amusement coloring his words. Cardon blinked, momentarily thrown off. "You wrote this?" he repeated, as though the idea were impossible. "That's what I said," Elijah replied, tilting his head slightly. "Want me to autograph it for you? Or are you just planning to keep rummaging through my things?" A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. Cardon's face flushed red as he shoved the book back into the bag with more force than necessary, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Cut the attitude," he snapped, his tone more defensive now. "This isn't over." Elijah raised his hands, mocking surrender. "Hey, you're the one making a scene," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. "I'm just trying to go about my day." Cardon ignored the comment and continued rifling through the bag, pulling out the laptop next. He inspected it, as if expecting to find something incriminating. When that failed, he set it aside and moved to the last item, a small leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. One particular entry caught his eye. "You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power. It's about service." Cardon froze for a moment, the words clearly resonating with him on some level, though he wasn't ready to admit it. The crowd, meanwhile, began to grow more restless. "Anything illegal in there, officer?" Elijah asked, his tone polite but laced with quiet challenge. Cardon slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag, frustration now playing on his face. "You're free to go," he barked, stepping back as though trying to regain his authority. Elijah didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Not so fast," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You stopped me, accused me of fitting a description, rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people. I think we're owed an explanation." The crowd erupted in agreement, voices calling out phrases like, "What's the reason?" and "You can't just walk away from this." Phones were now pointed directly at Cardon, their owners waiting for his next move. Cardon shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado slipping under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Elijah stood tall, calm, and unflinching. His mere presence made it impossible for the officer to brush this off. Cardon's face was a mixture of frustration and unease as he glanced at the crowd surrounding him. The sheer number of phones recording his every move seemed to shrink the air around him. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that he was now the one under scrutiny. Elijah locked eyes with Cardon. The silence between them stretched out like a challenge. "You're not going to answer?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying effortlessly over the murmur of the crowd. "What's this description I supposedly fit?" Cardon opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth was glaringly obvious to everyone watching. There had never been a description, just an excuse. "Let me guess," Elijah continued, his tone still calm, but now tinged with sharpness. "A black man walking down the street, minding his own business. That about sums it up, doesn't it? The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs, the tension building with every passing second. Cardon's jaw clenched as he struggled to find a response, but Elijah wasn't finished. "You see, officer," Elijah said, taking a step closer, "what you just did wasn't about keeping the streets safe. It was about power. You thought you could humiliate me, intimidate me, maybe even escalate this into something worse. But you didn't expect me to stay calm, did you?" Cardon's face flushed red, but he remained silent. "You didn't expect me to be a Navy SEAL," Elijah continued, his voice steady but piercing. "You didn't expect me to have the discipline to stay level-headed, or the experience to see through your game." The crowd hung on every word, some cheering softly, others nodding in agreement. Elijah turned slightly, addressing the growing audience. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "It's about the countless times this happens to people who don't have a camera watching, who don't have the training or the platform to push back. This isn't justice. It's harassment. And it needs to stop." The crowd responded with applause, their voices rising in support. Cardon, now visibly rattled, tried to interject. "I was just doing my job," he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. Elijah turned back to him, his expression one of quiet disappointment. "If this is how you define your job, maybe you're not cut out for it," he said simply. The words hit Cardon like a slap, and the crowd roared in agreement. People began calling out phrases like "hold him accountable" and "file a complaint." Cardon looked around, his authority crumbling under the weight of public opinion. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up. "Here's the deal, officer," he said. "You're going to stand here in front of all these people and explain why you stopped me." He let the implication hang in the air, tapping his phone screen. Cardon's eyes widened as he realized Elijah had been recording the entire interaction. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You don't owe me an apology," Elijah added, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You owe every single person here an explanation for why you thought you could abuse your power. So go ahead. Talk." The crowd fell silent, waiting for Cardon's response. The officer's face was pale now, his earlier arrogance completely drained away. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly panicking under the weight of the moment. Cardon stammered, his gaze darting between Elijah and the sea of recording phones. "I was acting on suspicion, just doing my duty, trying to ensure public safety." The crowd groaned, the flimsy excuse igniting murmurs of frustration and disbelief. A man near the front shook his head, muttering, "Same old story," while a woman called out, "What suspicion? Say it plainly." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his presence seemed to grow more commanding. He took a deliberate step closer, his calm gaze locking onto Cardon's flustered face. "Suspicion?" Elijah repeated, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Let me make this clear, officer. Suspicion is not a license to harass. It's not an excuse to stop someone without cause. And it's certainly not justification for targeting someone because of the color of their skin." Cardon opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah raised a hand, silencing him. The crowd cheered softly at the display of quiet authority. "You want to talk about suspicion?" Elijah continued, his voice rising slightly, sharper now. "What about the fact that you didn't ask anyone else on the street where they were going? What about the fact that you singled me out, rifled through my belongings, and tried to paint me as a threat? All without any evidence." Cardon's face turned red, his composure cracking under the intensity of Elijah's words. "I wasn't singling you out," he sputtered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Wink you? Because I don't see anyone else here being stopped." Elijah shot back, his calm demeanor now tinged with righteous indignation. "Or are you going to tell us all that they fit the same vague description you mentioned?" The crowd erupted in support, some shouting, "Answer him, and we see right through you." Cardon looked like a cornered animal, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by desperation. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones capturing his every move, and then back at Elijah, who stood tall and unwavering. Elijah lowered his voice, softening but losing none of its power. "Here's the truth, Officer Cardon, he said. You didn't expect me to push back. You thought you could get away with this because you've done it before. Probably more times than you can count. But not today. Today, you picked the wrong person.